Sebastian, what are you doing here?
I could use some help out there.
No way.
Are you kidding? Do you know how long it took me to come back here to talk to you about this?
I told you I wasn't going to leave this place. It's evil out there.
That may be, but there's evil within, too.
Man, that scene would have never happened in the first Evil Within, would it? As much as I love that first game, it was definitely more of a sensory experience than an emotional or a funny one.
Are you serious? It's a fucking nightmare.
Well, I didn't say it was perfect.
But Evil Within 2's director John Johanas and the rest of Tango Gameworks were not afraid to recenter the sequel around a much more versatile emotional core, no pun intended. And whereas the first game's reputation has soured a bit over the years, the second game has enjoyed quite a bit of praise and has often been called one of the best modern survival horror games. And while I personally prefer the first game, as my last video may have shown, I still appreciate the sequel, and it's a shame that it still hasn't sold 1 million copies to date, essentially guaranteeing that it won't get another entry, at least for a very long time. The exact reasons for this lack of success is hard to parse, but I do think its value to the industry is separate from its financial success. Now, I'd argue that it doesn't iron out nearly as many weaknesses from the first game as people like to think it does, but it does have many new strengths, like its semi-open world and its emotional story, that few games have rivaled since in the genre. So let's get into what the Evil Within 2 excels at, and also what it had to sacrifice in order to make the series more accessible. Now, if nothing else, Evil Within 2 is all about focus, and that extends all the way out from its creative process.
Copy that.
The first game's director, Shinji Mikami, had now become the executive producer, and he said the development time was considerably shorter for the second game than the first one, starting in 2015 right after they'd finished the first game's DLCs, and taking the better part of 2 years. Now, this was a marked improvement over the first game, which took the team 4 years, and saw the team switching to EdTech 5 mid-development and having to create the Hail Mary lore idea of the STEM system to unify all the disparate art design of their failed prototypes and pitches. Now, to me, the first game's unpredictability is an asset, but some players were put off by it. So Mikami notes that
the difference between this game's story and the first one is that we tried to focus on making it simpler and easier to understand.
This task fell to main scenario writer Shioji Ishimine, who would later write Ghostwire Tokyo and Persona 5 Tactics, and he was joined by American movie maker Trent Haga, who worked with Johanas on the first game's first 2 DLCs. Now, interestingly, despite the main writer being Japanese and many of the game's major influences also being Japanese, like Junji Ito's Uzumaki or Koji Suzuki's Ring series, the Evil Within 2 feels decidedly Western in its approach. We can see the flowing red cloth of the Cell movie, or the curtains from the Red Room in Twin Peaks, the environmental destruction of Inception, and the game's plot of a sad dad trying to save his child from a madman, a la Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners movie. It's all very Hollywood scriptwriting 101, with simple cause and effect setups and lots of melodramatic sentimental posturing in between. Now, that's not to say that any of this is really bad per se, and sometimes it's quite great, but it can be a bit on the nose, as the characters tend to say what the writers want you to get out of a scene instead of realistic dialogue that allows the audience to infer their meanings. But much of this is probably because of the heavy lifting it's having to do to establish emotional resonance, when the first game introduced a lot of these elements but didn't do much with them the first time around. And speaking of that first game, that story saw Sebastian, his partner Joseph Oda, and their protege Julie Kidman being sucked into the virtual world of STEM, which is controlled by its psychotic creator Ruvik. Ruvik had created this world in an attempt to live in a place where he was whole again and his sister was still alive. But a power-hungry scientist named Jimenez sold Ruvik out to his evil benefactors, the Mobius Corporation. They appropriated Ruvik's tech and tried to hook the world up to this hive mind of sorts that would be controlled by a central mind. That mind they hoped would be Leslie Withers once they shook Ruvik's influence free from STEM. Unfortunately, after Mobius grows impatient with Jimenez's progress, he tries to impress them by putting he and Leslie into the system and setting off an unauthorized wireless STEM prototype that pulls our characters in and sets off the events of the game. Now, while Sebastian drives out Ruvik from STEM, Ruvik escapes in Leslie's body to the real world, leaving Sebastian shattered by grief and trauma, having now lost his job because no one will believe his story about what just happened at Beacon. All this on top of having lost his daughter Lily to a fire years ago, ago, and his wife going missing while being convinced that their daughter Lily's death was a cover-up. But as we noted in my Evil Within video, Tango relegates almost all of Sebastian's emotional backstory to journal entries that don't impact the plot almost at all, so he's a bystander in the game he's starring in. Tango's first order of business in the sequel is to make Sebastian front and center, starting off with Lily's supposed death as its inciting incident, specifically a fever dream flashback of the night that Lily died in the house fire. Sebastian awakes from his fever dream passed out in a bar, obviously back to drinking after his life fully fell apart 3 years earlier in the Beacon incident. And who should show up but Julie Kidman with some very good, very bad news. Sebastian's daughter Lily isn't dead after all. She's actually being used as the new core brain that the STEM system is based around. But something's gone wrong, as she's no longer broadcasting signals back to Mobius and they've lost contact with their team inside. Mobius wants Sebastian's experience to help them recover their assets and salvage this new STEM system called Union, using his daughter's involvement as bait to motivate him to stick to the plan and pull off his end of the deal. Now, as plot motivators go, this is a pretty good one. Now, it's certainly very MacGuffin-oriented and contrived to put us back into STEM so all the cool stuff can happen, but it's playing organically with the bones of the story as we've known them and tapping into the things that we didn't get to see enough of in the first game. So right away, The Evil Within 2 is hugely improving on this aspect of the series. Now, we'll get into story spoilers more later on, but for now, the stage has been set for us to go back into STEM and find out what evil lies within the little town of Union. So STEM, or specifically Union, looks a little different this time around, and that's for several reasons. The first is that The Evil Within 2 runs on the STEM engine, a modified idTech 5 variant that boasts new character models and a much gamier, less gritty look to everything. Sebastian's character model receives special care as it did in the first game, looking extra rugged despite those dreamy brown eyes. The main cast of villains look great with all their deformities and crags and all that good stuff. The uglier something is in this game, the more the modeler tried to make it detailed. But that leaves the women in the game looking washed out, flat, or even last gen by comparison, as the modelers try to reduce their flaws till they start to not look like people anymore. The monsters are fortunately much more detailed, but often far less distinctive than the first game, being easily confusable with most other zombie games. The basic zombies just seem a little too Last of Us cordyceps coated, and several higher tier zombies borrow liberally from Left 4 Dead's white-haired witch, the boomer, and the spitter. Overall, there's just a much smaller and much less distinctive roster of bad guys this time around. The boss monsters like the Obscura are deliciously gruesome, but monsters like the Guardian look more goofy than scary, cackling madly as they run around with their giant chainsaw arm. It looks like a parody rather than something psychologically repulsive enough to hit me in the instincts. And I can't confirm this to be the case, but I get the sense that artist Takumi Nakamura being third billing in the credits of The Evil Within 2 maybe indicates that she didn't have the same influence as she did with the first game. You know, when she came up with Laura, the Keeper, the Haunted, the Amalgam Alpha, and all those other super memorable and super detailed monsters. The monsters just look more derivative this time around, and they also look a little weird against the conventional little Americana setup that is Union. Whereas the first game's horrible environments spawned horrible monsters, and that just kind of made sense. Here we see nightmares coming out of the mundane, out of shops and diners and all this kind of stuff. And while shows like Twin Peaks can show that this contrast is interesting, here it just feels sort of disjointed and out of place. And speaking of environments, instead of exploring old medieval architecture or skyscraper graveyards like the first game did, Sebastian explores the city of Union, which is, supposed to look like a Norman Rockwell painting so that it pacifies the minds hooked up to it. Now, of course, something's gone big wrong, so Union is breaking up Inception style into these floating mini-continents. But most of where you'll be traveling through are conventional modern areas like gas stations, trucking garages, diners, and bars, and they're only broken up by the underground bunkers with the occasional lab in them called the Marrow. And while all of this is rendered well enough, the textures and asset placement are unevenly interesting to look at, a problem that the first game never had. And that's weird to think is happening because so much of the design of this game cribs from the Batman Arkham games, which is a series known for having pretty great environmental art direction. Evil Within 2 also breaks the cardinal rule that Evil Within stuck with, which was that no matter how fantastic things got, it always felt like it was happening to a real place, even if it was a more exotic place than we're normally accustomed to. Union breaking down and pieces of it floating all around and there being this eye monster in the sky may look cool enough, but it also just feels a little bit too obviously fake and gamey in a way that the original didn't. In the first game, every hallway and piece of furniture was distressed and angled a certain way to make it feel like it had history, but most assets in The Evil Within 2 lack this level of detail. One level, late game, is supposed to be a hellish fortress that you're ascending to get to the big bad, but aside from the fire looking quite good, the rest of the environment is just sort of barely rusted with bland colors and textures. Oh, and remember all those particle effects in the first game that made every frame feel, dilapidated, infected, and suffocating? Union is apparently just too nice of a place for all that air pollution, so instead we get a nicely colored and contrasted environment, but one which lacks any real texture or grime. It just looks too clean. Not only that, but the constant nighttime outside would make you think there'd be some scary outdoor scenes like the first game had. But the nighttime here is the most approachable kind of Hollywood-style night where things are blue tinted instead of black as night, so your visibility isn't really hindered at all, and it loses a lot of atmosphere. Unlike the last game where you actually needed your lantern to see, but were afraid it would alert enemies in the dark. Now, the art direction does make some interesting choices, calling on the Iroguro art movement for some of its villain Stefano's levels, but it's about all you get throughout the whole game that looks striking, definitive, and distinctive. When the game cooks, it's on fire, but man, is it a far less interesting place to look at on average. Fortunately, the game makes up for its sometimes drab looks by being a really functionally great gameplay space to play in. The Evil Within 2 deserves its flowers for being one of the best designed open worlds ever made, full stop. Primarily because it's not a true open world in the grand modern sense, but a semi-open world of a couple city streets with their accompanying buildings and surrounding topography like parks and fields and light forestry. John Johanas described Tango's approach to Game Rant as follows.
Scale is one thing. It's really easy to make something big. You just make it big, but you have to find the right density. One of the things we wanted to make sure this time is that it's not too suffocating in terms of how we presented horror elements compared to the first game. We want it to be open so you can explore at your own pace and have a sort of ebb and flow to horror experiences in downtime. That just takes trial and error, going back and forth. But because the trial and error period was very quick, we made things, we adjusted based on feedback very quickly.
Interestingly, the initial concepts for the first Evil Within had started out as an open world game too, and even had side activities like fishing at one point. Union may not be the most interesting place to look at, but it's one of the most focused and rewarding game locations in the whole open world adjacent space. Resources to craft ammo and parts to upgrade your weapons are littered all over the place, in corners, trash cans, and often wedged in between a large variety of enemy configurations and environmental layouts. The real question is, can you skillfully manage your weapons and your stealth capabilities enough relative to the enemy configurations so that you can survive this encounter and not hamstring the rest of your future exploration if you expend too many resources now? It's just a real joy to explore, and you constantly feel yourself growing a little bit more capable in how you're able to tackle the next obstacle. Now, sometimes you'll see very clearly telegraphed encounters brewing, or sometimes it'll come as a complete surprise, like when you're walking through an otherwise unremarkable field and all of a sudden 3 zombies bolt up right out of the tall grass to ambush you. One of the best scares in the game is when the Guardian assembles itself out of a pile of corpses, which wasn't the case in the previous open area with the same pile of bodies. So it's extremely unexpected and unnerving, and worst of all, even if you can get away from this Guardian, you'll have to keep avoiding its roaming behavior as you explore if you don't just outright kill it. And that's before it spawns another version of itself on the opposite end of the map. It's great stuff, and it really puts you in that survival horror state of mind. The Evil Within 2 also implements actual puzzles throughout, unlike its predecessor, which just had a couple simple ones, and they were even less difficult and involved than RE4, which barely had any. Here, you'll need to solve those classic breaker puzzles that you see in many survival horror games, and you'll match 2 frequency bands like you would in the Batman Arkham games, and you'll even get a classic puzzle type where you rotate the various discs using cranks so they can line up to create a picture. Now, it's all stuff that you've seen 1,000 times before, but it's nice that there's some actual attention paid to these sort of classic, tried and true elements when so little was done with them the first time around. And speaking of puzzles, let's actually circle back to the open world design really quickly, as there are some puzzle elements in the recurring encounters with the Anima. Now, she's this incredibly freaky being who's essentially sucking out the souls or the minds of anyone here and turning them into the zombies that you see. She's modeled after an Onryo, a type of ghost that Sadako from The Ring is. In fact, there's a bit of an overuse of this hair covering the eyes trope, as Laura from the last game was modeled after it. The Left 4 Dead witch in this game has it. the anima has it, and so too do the Guardian's many heads. But at least the anima is more of a stealth, stalker horror archetype that you're trying to evade, as she hums the classic Claire de Lune save theme and threatens to kill you in one touch if you're seen. You have to evade her in one of two different ways. If you're just out and about in Union, she'll pop up in a variety of predetermined places, and you essentially just need to keep your distance and run to the edge of this zone to despawn her. Now these are pretty lame, and they're no challenge at all, as she's never really close enough to get to you. But the much more interesting encounters happen when you'll just be exploring some random house, and she'll whisk you away to a facsimile of Beacon Hospital from the first game. And when she does so, she'll put you in this linear area that has a stealth sequence attached to it that varies, depending on which of the three encounters that you can see. There's a really awkward to parse out mirror puzzle in here where you have to sneak up and see which door in the area is glowing to know which to go through so you can advance the sequence, all the while avoiding her gaze. That said, while she's clearly a welcome excuse to bring up the first game, the anima's inclusion can seem a bit random as she's extremely easy to beat and often ends up feeling just like Laura from the first game. Her stealth sections aren't incredibly well designed as they're either too easy or not really designed very well, so you basically just have to get up and run past her and hope she doesn't catch up to you, so it's not really a stealth sequence after all. That said, the way her appearances feel so organic and emergent despite being totally scripted are part of the black magic that Tango's conjured up here. These and all the other bespoke encounters throughout the world just never quite feel like the other, and they're the most impressive part of this game's open world design. I never thought The Evil Within needed to be an open world, and I'm definitely sick of those Witcher 3 style open worlds with just, endless things to go to. But after playing this one 3 times recently for this video, I can safely say that this has to be the future of open worlds. It just feels like we really should be going for the quality versus quantity approach where we make these things that feel as if they're just something that you're finding out in the wilds, even though of course they're hyper-crafted, well play-tested, and end up feeling good to play instead of just some, go here, kill a mob, go here, grab an item, and come back. I mean, isn't it time we put a little creativity back into our games instead of everything just feeling like a scope creep all the time? But that's a topic for another day. Now back to The Evil Within 2, my only other complaint as far as the world design is how boring the Marrow levels are. The Marrow is the name given to the backstage portion of STEM, essentially an off-grid way of traveling between the crumbling parts of Union City. It's a cool concept and name, but my goodness are these areas dull to look at and traverse. They're almost all these industrial white brick bunkers with some computers and the occasional lab setup sprinkled throughout. The loading screens in between Union and the Marrow are also weirdly broken up, where you click on a computer, a void of a loading screen appears, and then you walk forward to another computer, click, and then wait for it to load the next area. Okay? And aside from feeling like these may have influenced Sam Lake in his creation of the thresholds in Alan Wake 2, these are not terribly interesting spaces to explore. They're slow to load up and they're slow to get good a lot of the time. Overall, they're not terrible, but one of the most frustrating fights of the game is down here with this giant swarm of dudes that just never feels like you have the capabilities to fight back in an interesting way. And this is about the only encounter down here that's not got the camera crammed up Sebastian's bum or needing a series of stealth kills to get past. Like so much of the game's scope and its linear sequences, the game often just feels too zoomed in on Sebastian, like the Callisto Protocol or God of War 2018. And so I guess it makes sense that you can only expect so much to happen down here because they're giving you this hyper-linear window of perception, so they don't want to push you any farther than they have to. And that's honestly what The Evil Within 2 feels like when it's not doing its open world best. Cramped and a bit lame. But let's zoom out a little bit and look at what Sebastian is doing more often than not in the open world, in terms of general gameplay. While the basic gameplay of sneaking and shooting is fairly similar between both Evil Within games, Johanas and company wanted to give the player the ability to problem solve in a way that was as multivariate as the environments were, and often because of the environment. While the first Evil Within had some big areas like Chapter 2 where you could stealth kill or try to run people into traps or shoot your way out, these areas were phased out pretty early and they were sorely missed in the late game. Evil Within 2, to its credit, tends to take the best parts of those early big areas with all these different avenues you could go down and applies that same ethic to the indoor and outdoor sections up here on the kind of the overworld. And they have this great sense of escalation and player control for how encounters go down. The wide open areas leave lots of room for your Sebastian to approach stealthily and throw bottles to distract or pull enemies away from the crowd so that you can stealth kill them one by one, or at least make the horde a little smaller when you do go in guns blazing. Often you'll want to stealth kill your way around though. For one reason, the camera's a lot more accommodating of the stealth animation, and it gives you a bigger field of view to work with than the first game did, and the stealth kills are just less finicky to fall off and more satisfying. Not only that, but ammo can feel much less plentiful than the first game, and also a bit less powerful unless you're really upgrading the damage of the gun that you do have ammo for. So stealth becomes a necessity, so much so that you're essentially playing a survival horror Far Cry a lot of the time, only much less repetitive in how encounters play out. Also, like Far Cry and the first game, you'll have upgrade trees to play with.
Let's change you further. Give you the tools you need to find her.
Sebastian's abilities are split up into combat, stealth, health recovery, and athleticism. And while those categories sound pretty bland, they're not just stat upgrades anymore and are often filled with specific abilities for specific situations. Now sure, health and health recovery are pretty self-explanatory, but the other categories all have some pretty game-changing abilities within them. Athleticism is mostly just about upgrading your sprint time, which is several seconds longer than the first game's was, but the balance is that he tends to run slower for a little bit longer. In fact, when I had just played on Nightmare, the sprint made the whole difference between basically being toast or living to fight another day. This is extra true since the game has a really awful new set of balancing features where if an enemy sees you, they roar, which temporarily stuns Sebastian so that he stops responding to your inputs for a bit, and his line of sight often gets pulled towards the enemy that spotted you and is chasing you, kind of like you're caught in a tractor beam and can't really run independent of where the enemy is facing, so you can never quite break free. This doesn't happen a ton, or even most of the time, but when it does, it's really annoying, and the only way to kind of outpace it is if your sprint's high enough that you can actually outlast this tractor beam once it stops affecting you. But athleticism's highest tiers aren't just about running. They also give you a percentage increase to automatically dodge certain attacks, which can be invaluable. The abilities just get juicier from there on out. Combat abilities start out conventionally enough, reducing reticle sway and kickback and increasing melee damage with knives and hand axes that you pick up, and you even get a push kick to knock over stunned enemies. But the real craziness starts with the highest tier synaptic focus and bullet cascade abilities. Now, bullet cascade is a damage multiplier that increases for each consecutive shot as long as you keep connecting, and it can prove devastating to bosses. Synaptic focus is just a fancy way of saying bullet time, which of course is weird in a survival horror adjacent title, but don't worry, people will bitch and moan about the first game not being survival horror enough with its upgrade trees and not make a peep about this. I don't care, but y'all sure pretend to. Vendettas aside, bullet time is exactly what you'd expect, and it runs out the same stamina meter as your sprint does, so you'll want to stop and pop so you have energy to work with. Lining up devastating headshots or hitting bosses' weak points is a huge boon, and it's game-changing with only a couple of caveats. For one, the bright yellow filter of the synaptic focus often makes it really hard to see what you're aiming at, especially when you're using the laser-sighted handgun, which never seems to be aiming at the right angle anyway. For another reason, it takes 70,000 gel to buy this ability, and that's after you've already spent thousands of gel on the previous abilities in the skill tree to unlock it in the first place. When I replayed the game recently and saved up for exactly the combat abilities in that tree to get to the synaptic focus ability and bought nothing else, it still took me nearly half the game to unlock it, meaning that I was losing out on all the other abilities like sprint and stealth and reduced weapon kickback and all of that just to get this one super powerful ability. So it's very easy to just miss out on because you can't possibly be expected to save that much throughout the game. And even if you do, you don't get nearly as much of the game with that ability as you might like, unless you're playing on New Game Plus. Now, the mid-game boss fight that happens right around the time that you can unlock it becomes a lot easier using bullet time, but the trade-off is that you're playing a much less fun version of this game for about the first 8 to 9 hours. So to my mind, you really need to focus on stealth because the game seems better built for it, and it's honestly got ridiculous implications as it virtually upgrades the rest of your kit. So the stealth tree starts out innocuously enough, though even here it's game-changing, reducing the sound of your footsteps so you can sneak up on enemies for a knife kill more easily. Nightmare difficulty gives you no eye marker up top to show what state of awareness your enemies are in, but once I played the game again on survival, I realized just how much difficulty I had reduced for myself by upgrading this ability up front. The enemies turn around far more often than is reasonable in a stealth-oriented game, or even the last game, so you're often getting found out in cheap ways. But as you upgrade your low-profile ability, you can start to see the game intentionally telling them not to turn around as much, and you can pick them off far more often. In concert with the increased sneak speed, you can take out whole gangs as long as you're catching them away from crowds or distracting them with thrown bottles to draw their attention away. Unfortunately, the enemy AI is so hard to manipulate and so non-committal to the distractions that you put in their way, it can often be hard to even the odds in your favor. Now, perhaps Tango wanted to ensure that enemies don't follow you across the whole map once they're alerted, so they gave them tight leashes, but it's pretty annoying how hard it is to mess with the AIs when they jitter around so much anyway and are hard to corral with distractions because of their inconsistent responses. Now, if they see you and they charge charge you, you can actually use one of the best abilities in the game called the bottle break, which automatically breaks one of the bottles in your inventory over their head to get you some space. This saves a lot of damage and makes it to where you can gain extra utility from the bottles that you might not be using as distractions. Not to mention it knocks them back and gives you a second to shoot them that you wouldn't otherwise have. And if all of these abilities aren't lethal enough, you can even get the ambush and predator abilities. Now predator isn't the easiest thing to get working for you, but it's essentially a prompt to hit a button to sprint up to an unaware enemy very quickly for a stealth kill, so you don't have to worry about inching up to get them. It's a little inconsistent, so I don't rate it higher, but the ambush ability? Many games have exploits, and ambush feels like the Evil Within 2's exploit, as you can take cover and knife kill unaware enemies as they come near your position. And this doesn't always work, as the prompt will sometimes go away if your camera angle is too far up or down, but generally speaking, you can do stuff like I'm doing here, where I just line up a whole gang of zombies one after the other with bottle distractions and make easy work of them. It's really effective, and it feels like Tango leveling up their creativity with what could have otherwise just been a very simple sneak and stab mechanic from the first game. Here, the stealth has enough layers that reward patience and end in powerful displays to make you want to seek out the situations in which you can pull off these things in a skillful and satisfying manner. All that to say, while the bullet time ability is cool, holding out for half the game to get it isn't. And stealth is an utterly broken build because it costs no ammo, just time and patience, which is technically unlimited, because stealth is preferable and it means you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls of the shooting mechanics. Now, much like the first game, all of Sebastian's weapons have, their fire rates, magazine sizes, reload times, damage, and critical damage that can be upgraded. A very welcome change from the first game is that each upgrade applies to every weapon in a category. So if you upgraded the laser-sighted handgun's accuracy, that would apply to any subsequent additions to that category, like the revolver or the magnum that you get in New Game Plus. The only decision that makes no real sense is why there are ammo carrying capacity upgrades littered throughout the world. Considering on a New Game Plus run that I had sandbagged all of my crafting materials to the very last level and could only make 28 sniper bullets, let's say, there's clearly not enough ammo ingredients in this game to ever max out a pouch for really any of the guns outside of maybe the pistol, which is not a terrible weapon, but it's not super ideal because it takes a while to get highly damaging enough to make those shots count. In fact, the scarcity of ammo is a boon for survival horror fans who will really feel like this is essentially just a stealth game with occasional gunplay, although of course this is far more pronounced on Nightmare, whereas certain sections of survival will feel way too easy by comparison. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty of what you will be using on every difficulty, which is your slightly updated arsenal. You don't get any grenades this time around, which is too bad, but you do start with a 1911 looking handgun, and then you get a terrible silenced pistol, and then a laser-sighted handgun. You also get a short-barreled pump shotgun, a long-barreled shotgun, and a double-barreled shotgun, as well as a sniper rifle, a flamethrower, and of course, the agony crossbow. The Warden crossbow, because this game likes to be less hardcore whenever it can for some reason. Now, none of the weapons are bad outside of perhaps the pistols, and that's only a couple of them, because they never seem to do enough damage. But the weapon effects are generally pretty good across the board, although every gun has something just a little bit off about it. The crossbow is pretty decent, having the classic harpoon, shock, freeze, and explosive bolts, and adding the smoke bolt, which disorientates enemies and makes them susceptible to sneak attacks while affected. It does its job, and the harpoon bolts are a great combo with the bullet time ability, and explosive bolts are powerful if not nearly as cool to look at as they were in the first game. Freeze bolts come a little too late in this game to really make a huge difference, at least in my opinion, but the shock bolts can take out 5 enemies in one puddle, which is something for the ages. That said, I hate how this crossbow turns the spring mechanism vertical when firing. It just looks way less cool and way less like a crossbow, and the charge time to shoot is agonizingly slow, no pun intended. Sure, it can be upgraded, but it looks markedly less cool and is less powerful than the last games, which is kind of disappointing. That's not to say you won't get some great headshots with the weapon like most things in this game, but if you're having to aim in tight, you can forget about hitting anything. To offset this accuracy chasm, you get a flamethrower, but it shows up late and is a bit of a meme, as most flamethrowers tend to be, as it has very little ammo and requires a lot to make more. That said, you can invite yourself to the barbecue and treat yourself to using it on a couple crowds as you go, just for fun. As it turns out, the real stars of the show are the shotguns, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Their power can blow enemies' heads clean off in one go, or really put the hurt on bosses and mini-bosses in ways that no other gun can. But perhaps most importantly, it's the only gun type that really offsets the occasionally horrendous hit detection. Now, some misses you're seeing on screen are entirely because of how unsensitive the game is to control on console thumbsticks, but some shots just inexplicably do less damage than they should for where they hit an enemy, and that's if they hit at all. And the first game kind of had this problem too, but it was because of bloom, and it wanted you to aim and wait for the reticle to shrink before firing. Here, I see no such bloom, and I can't fathom why the hitboxes are so small and how easy it is to miss if you aim even slightly to the right or the left. I've even had point-blank shots in slow motion with a laser-sighted handgun miss entirely, which is both a part of the hit detection's fault, but also how crooked that laser sight can be compared to where it should be facing. Now, the sniper rifle, which I gave a bad rap in my Evil Within video, is actually better than I gave it credit for, or at least I remembered it to be. On Nightmare, there's almost no ammo for it, but on Survival, when you actually craft this weapon out of the broken pieces that you pick up in the world, you get a full clip or two right off the bat, which is, at least 5 or 6 kills there, right? And the game seems to drop a little bit more ammo for it throughout. But as powerful and equalizing as it is to pick off guys across the map in this open world environment, this poor thing still has to deal with poor hit detection. I can't stress how much this game asks for pinpoint accuracy or bust, as it punishes what look like even dead-on balls accurate shots.
Dead-on balls accurate?
It's an industry term.
Funnily enough, you never hear anyone complain about the combat in this game. It's not that it's terrible, mind you. It has its moments. It just feels way more generic to control, and even then it still has that way zoomed in view from the first game, and a lot of the same problems that arise from it when enemies are lunging at you very quickly to your left shoulder and you miss high and right. Now, this is obviously by design to test your aiming, so I get why it's here in theory, but the Evil Within 2 just makes it silly hard to adjust for. It means you end up taking a lot of cheap damage because your camera view is just way too close to the character. This is compounded by how many scripted events stuff the camera in Sebastian's ass pocket while you're swarmed by enemies in tight. Doesn't help that the inputs are pretty laggy too. When you hack open crates to reveal the items within, it takes a full second or so before you can interact with these items, even if the prompts to pick them up are already on screen. This means that you're sitting there clicking and clicking while you wait to pick something up. The first game never had this problem, and in fact is very responsive to you picking stuff up. The second game can't even get this right, and it's just a needless irritation. In addition to that annoying stun and tractor beam thing that enemies can do to you sometimes when they roar, there's also a profound amount of lag or just outright laborious animation downtime while you wait for Sebastian to be controllable again after he's been grabbed or knocked down. The game is really slow to clear out all these tedious animations so that you can actually respond and retaliate. So oftentimes you can get stuck in loops and not be able to do anything. Clicking to sprint is also finicky as hell too on a controller. Sometimes it looks like you're not running fast enough, and you're like, well, I guess I didn't click it. So you'll click it again to make him run, but then it'll actually just stop entirely. Let's not get started how many times the climbing animation wigs out and either gets you stuck for a second on an object or just kind of drops you off, so you have to try again because it didn't like your angle of entry. So yeah, that was a great wall of negative feedback. I get it. So let's try and even out the vibe here. So when things are going right, the combat has some fantastic feedback and even features yet another RE4 style cabin holdout in the later chapters that feeds you ammo constantly and keeps the intensity up.
Just keep coming!
Then so will we.
That's what she said.
Headshotting these big lava monsters looks great too, and it's a stroke of wicked genius that if you shoot their arms off instead of their heads, they'll actually start throwing lava at you out of these orifices. It's also really satisfying to sneak up on these lament enemies which can scream and alert a horde or spit acid pools at you from a distance. If you sneak up on them, you get a really cool animation and then are thrown to the ground while the lament's stunned. I figured out that you could shock bolt these things right as you get up from this animation, and then just unload your shotgun into them to make them unable to cry out for help and basically lock them up, taking out a very tough enemy for a ton of green gel without having to do much more than pull off the perfect murder. Little things like this, or figuring out how to take the witches out without getting smushed, are really fun. I figured out that while the witch eats shotgun shells and axe hits like Certerios, she does not do well with sniper headshots. So I just sat my happy ass down like the shooter on the grassy knoll and knocked her head clean off from a mile away, easy peasy lemon squeezy, and I slept just fine that night. But as fun as these fights can be, And my goodness, if it's not outrageously tense to get seen, hear that blood-curdling roar, and then the battle music kicks in. I just wish it all controlled better. It's funny because while I just complain that a lot of these frustrations make the game harder, The Evil Within 2 is also paradoxically too easy in many respects. Now obviously the first game can be pretty tough and it's just janky enough to be frustrating, but The Evil Within 2's bosses, for instance, are fairly simplistic to engage even if they look impressive, and sometimes they just seem to forget that they're even fighting you, like this fight with the Guardian. Like the enemies in the open world, her AI loses track of you so often you almost can't lead her into any of the traps in the environment without getting too close to her and getting kind of stuck in her orbit. Now, a nice survival horror touch is that there's actually a gauntlet of traps around the back of this building that you can escape through and avoid her altogether, which is ingenious, but if you want to stand your ground, it's a bit awkward to do so. The combat's just very inconsistently enjoyable to me, so it's hard not to keep complimenting it and then saying, well, I enjoy it, but, and then insert a criticism. One minute I'm ecstatic that I pulled off a sweet headshot or I stacked up all my abilities in a profoundly powerful way. The next I'm screaming that I got stun locked or stuck on the environment with Sebastian's weird lumbering sprint, or I'm cursing the camera for being too close so that I can't properly account for all the things I need to run around to break up my pursuer's line of sight, or perhaps jump over to get some distance. And that's if I'm not inexplicably missing point-blank shots or fighting the stiff aiming, or being told that my shotgun blast to the upper shoulder area was a ½ millimeter off so it didn't headshot the enemy, meaning I had to waste more resources to finish this guy off. Stuff like this makes me very confident that my assertion from my last video was correct, that people will forgive a game 1,000 grievances if they like the story enough, as so many of the problems of the first game resurface and brand new ones appear that stick out all the more when the controls generally feel more basic and accessible and modernized. It somehow feels more generic than the last game, and yet also frustratingly not quite as good as you would expect based on how other parts feel like they've been updated. And it's too bad because you can tell that Tango did a lot of work to make Sebastian's animations feel more fluid, like just controlling him and moving around. While the first game was more responsive in general, it also looked a little herky-jerky because of how fast Sebastian would transition in between animations. In The Evil Within 2, your basic running and walking feels very fluid to control, and there's a lot of momentum in how he moves, so you're not having to constantly adjust and micromanage the way he moves. All that to say, the controls are still a mixed bag, and they keep the game from feeling all that great a lot of the time. And stealth is not only more fun, but it's way more effective than the gunplay is because it cuts out finicking with all this other BS. And that's partially okay because this game is a lot more consistent about its Far Cry-esque gameplay, when it allows the player freedom to figure out how to tackle each individual problem, instead of funneling them through combat encounters where confrontation is inevitable. It's also conducive to making this game feel a lot more like survival horror on average, or at least on Nightmare, when you're not actually given enough resources to just kill everything in your path. You can't go willy-nilly killing the Guardian mini-bosses or the roaming flamethrower guys. You've got to evade them whenever they arise, and it adds a layer of danger and unpredictability and tension that's a welcome evolution on the first game's core formula. All that to say, the open world feels wonderful and exciting to explore. It's really pleasing to feel yourself gradually getting more and more powerful as you find more parts to upgrade your weapons and make ammo and unlock new abilities through the gel that nearly every enemy drops. There's just a lot of creativity in how encounters are set up and how they can play out. It takes a lot of playtesting and balancing to make open spaces feel tense and crafted and rewarding, and Tango has just simply done their homework here. But while the gameplay certainly has its ebbs and flows, the real star of the show is the new focus on Sebastian's motivations and having a more comprehensible Hollywood-esque story. So let's go ahead and drive out to Spoiler Town, skip to the timestamp on screen to miss out on what is really the best part of this game in a lot of ways, with some caveats. Well, here we are, at the most lauded part of The Evil Within 2, and for good reason, because this game's restored a lot of faith in the series by doing what the first game simply wasn't as interested in, and that was making Sebastian not just a vibe, but a character. Vibes can work in games and often do, so it's not so much a lack as a welcome evolution. That said, as great as the emotional moments can be and how spectacular the ending is, there's a lot of melodrama and on-the-nose writing that can make this game feel like it's trying way too hard to appeal to a modern audience in terms of being quippy, overly light, or try hard in its horror. But let's just get into the story proper, commenting as we go. So as we noted earlier, The Evil Within 2 starts 3 years after the first game. We find Sebastian's having a guilt and alcohol-fueled nightmare about the night his daughter Lily supposedly died in a house fire, asking why Sebastian didn't save her. He's awoken by Julie Kidman of Mobius, whom he's been searching for along with his missing wife Myra ever since the Beacon incident. Unbeknownst to him, the last game ended with Myra being revealed as a Mobius agent somehow. Now this is indeed a plot hole as we'll address later, but for now let's address how and why Julie Kidman is somehow still able to work with Mobius. Her 2 DLCs, because the assignment and the consequence are all about her resisting the administrator's wishes that she go and retrieve Leslie. She even has to defeat his monstrous form after she's basically caught trying to kill Leslie so that Ruvik can't use him to escape. So how is she able to basically mess up their most important plans, get a smack on the wrist, and is now just back in the rotation? No idea. And unfortunately, all these plot contrivances were part of the series lore from the outset, so they're kinda baked in.
Ugh. Who comes up with this stuff?
So the dubiously still employed Kidman puts it to Sebastian that Mobius needs his help. Myra was right. Lily didn't die in the fire, but was made to look like she did, so that Mobius could squirrel her away and use her extremely innocent, precocious mind to be the core mind in STEM, which is the role that Leslie was originally supposed to be used for.
Losing our minds! Losing our minds! Losing our minds!
Sebastian, of course, loses his mind at this news.
Where did you get this?
Lily's still alive.
Now you'll notice that he and everybody else have different voice actors from the first game. Sebastian's voice actor Marcus Bobisic took a little while to grow on me. Whereas Anson Mount's delivery was aloof, Marcus swings a little too far in the other direction of being overwrought. Every line being the same intonation and delivery, sometimes even channeling Christian Bale's Batman.
Where are they? Where did you get this?
Though he does do some great work by the game's end. As for the writing, Sebastian's still asking stupid questions once he's in STEM, like, was that real or just all in my mind?
Did I just imagine that? No. That was... What was that thing? Was that real or all in my mind?
Dude, you're in a subjective mindscape. That's how this works, dude.
What the fuck?
But anyway, after Sebastian understandably but kind of goofily freaks out, Mobius subdues him and brings him to HQ, telling him that STEM is breaking down. They've lost contact with Lily, and they want his experience with STEM to help retrieve Lily for his sake, but mostly theirs. It's a good setup, even if it feels a little contrived, right? But at least it's getting into new territory and revitalizing some untouched on elements from the first story's core story bits. So Sebastian.
What the fuck?
So Sebastian agrees to go back in with Kidman as his contact, and we're off to the races. We get a great intro, full of stylish transitions, some great facial animations, and even a flashback to Beacon Mental Hospital, which was kind of heartwarming considering my affection for that game and how disconcertingly different so many other things in this game can feel.
All units 1199. Let's flight cover code 3, Beacon Mental Hospital.
We also get a heretofore seen flashback that paints Sebastian, Myra, and Lily as an ideal family, and boy does it lay it on thick with what they want you to get out of this scene. I have an amazingly smart and beautiful wife.
Got a wonderful family. An amazingly smart and beautiful wife. Why wouldn't I be all right? Come here, Myra.
What would otherwise just be that perfunctory scene where we complain that, I had a beautiful life until it was taken away, is now a cloyingly sentimental and so full of cheese scene that is likely to induce lactose intolerance. Now right away we have two narrative pushes that I find kind of tedious. Hallmark sentimentality and this weird fascination with try-hard girl power.
An amazingly smart and beautiful wife.
Now, if you think I'm knee-jerk reaction, just stick with me, as we'll see 4 or 5 more instances of this kind of sycophantic tell instead of show writing that feels like HR is in the room, as Skillup would say. But once this vision passes, Sebastian's soon up to his ears in bad stuff. The Guardian shows up to chase him, and he only escapes because of a knife thrown into his chest from an unnamed man with a camera and a purple suit.
What is going on here?
Ah, that's a Sebastian I know, constantly swearing and asking stupid questions like that annoying friend that won't stop asking what's going on while you're watching a movie. Some things never change. And in what feels like one of those RE1 zombie reveals, or even the Valerio zombie reveal in the last game, we get another memeable skin and bones, domestic gore fest to introduce us to the fact that the people in STEM are turning into zombies yet again. Things are starting to mirror Beacon. The difference this time is that there are other NPCs that you can interact with that are friendly, and you can talk to them through dialogue options. These NPCs are Mobius agents who will give you side missions and provide context into the world. Hoffman, the team psychologist, is my favorite of the group.
How do you know my name?
I told you.
As she gets some funny jokes in about her job.
Right.
the team psychologist.
And she's generally a calm, resolute, reliable, and smart individual that you want on your side, and she wants to redeem herself for working for Mobius. Sykes is also a likable guy, and his attempts to use a backdoor out of STEM are a cool lore point as well. All these new interactions are maybe a little long-winded, but they're all welcome, and they're necessary as the story ends up having big consequences for all these characters. But our real goal throughout all this madness is to find the purple-coated man, whom we learn is Stefano Valentini, a war photographer turned artist who somehow faked his mental profile to get into Union so he could wreak havoc here. Apparently, photographing so many dead people in the war drove him bonkers, and he now pursues death as an art form, essentially using his camera to freeze in time the last moments of his victims so that can be replayed into infinity, or assembling their body parts into vile sculptures. Worst of all, he's after Lily, so this gets personal fast. This serial killer who wants the most vulnerable person in STEM thing mirrors Ruvik and Leslie from the first game, and for the first half or so of the game, it feels like a meaningful evolution of the series' core conceits. It feels familiar. But Stefano is gone from the main narrative about halfway through, and his presence is definitely felt, as the rest of the game suffers. And this is important because Stefano is really only in 2 major cutscenes, otherwise he's just sort of a figure in the distance that we keep losing track of. So that should tell you how important his over-the-top but fun villainy is to the feel and the tone of the Evil Within series. Tango borrows pretty heavily from the Batman Arkham games and the Evil Within 2. There's the frequency matching puzzle design to the dodge the spotlight scarecrow sequence, but what they probably needed to copy more than anything from Rocksteady was their Joker fetish. Whereas the Batman Arkham games have needed to do away with the Joker for a while now, Tango actually needed to keep their Joker-coated, theatrical, purple-suited psychopath around for a little longer because the rest of the villains in the second half of the game just feel like plot devices that are meant to tease out Sebastian's character development more than anything else. After Stefano dies, Sebastian learns that his missing wife Myra is here in STEM too, but she's changed, becoming something incredibly powerful, feral, and territorial, a mama bear gone bonkers. Her obsession with protecting Lily has twisted her mind, and she shows up to abscond with Lily. Soon, Sebastian is whisked away into a very familiar medieval dungeon full of fire. The cult emblem from the first game shows up, and we see those medieval torture devices again. It all feels very much like the first game's catacombs right before the Keeper, and intentionally so. But as good as it feels to be in an actual Evil Within feeling location, the reason for it existing feels kind of contrived. We soon meet its creator, another antagonist, Stefano's boss, the man calling himself Father Theodore. He's a cult leader whose charisma has netted him tons of followers, and he seems to have used that following to leverage a position in union with Mobius. And right off the bat, Father Theodore feels less like a character and more like a plot device to get Sebastian to introspect and conquer his fears and self-doubt. He opines about how Sebastian's racked with guilt and loss and that Father Theodore is the only one that can set him free from that which holds him back. He's basically if Joel Osteen was combined with a satanic priest who promised the world and all the power thereof if they engage in a Faustian, join the dark side type of bargain with him. So in other words, Joel Osteen. El Padre Teddy Bear's got a flair for the dramatic, showing Sebastian visions and burning writing on the wall. But as Sebastian asks in their first official meeting,
Another lunatic with a god complex, huh? I already killed one of you today.
the writer seems self-aware that Father Theodore is a bit redundant, and he just never shuts up, inviting us to get Lily back from Myra so they can control STEM for themselves. He throws Sebastian back into STEM proper when he resists, hoping that Sebastian will come back to him of his own free will. And considering that Theodore puts Sebastian right in front of someone who's also planning against him, you have to forehead smack at the convenience of the scene changes here, something the first game gets ragged on a lot for, but no one seems to care, despite it being way more contrived here. But hey, at least we get to do another cabin-style holdout like you got to do in RE4 in the first game, only this time we're accompanied by a new face, a capable Mobius defector called Esmeralda Torres. Torres is an awkward bird. She's got one of those annoying, raspy Jennifer Lawrence voices, a propensity for moving heavy things that bodybuilders couldn't move, all by herself because she doesn't need no man, and roasting Sebastian for being an old man.
Whoa, you alright? Let
Get
me
your
help.
ass through before I drop it on your head.
Okay, I've got it.
Thanks. You need a break after that, old man? Gonna have to duck. Don't blow your back out.
This isn't the time, Taurus.
I just kept asking myself, where's all this coming from?
This is ridiculous.
Then she reveals that she's actually in league with Myra, part of the big plan that several Mobius defectors had to take down STEM from the inside. She hopes to redeem herself after being the one that actually kidnapped Lily in the fake house fire death.
You should be proud of your wife. She's compelling. She recruited me for this plan.
I don't understand. Why would she join them?
She found out they had Lily and knew the only way to take them down was from the inside. So she joined up and waited for the right moment.
All these years. That's where she was.
But of course this makes no sense because Mobius already very much knew who she was and in fact found her to be quite the pain in their side once she wouldn't give up the chase. So for her to infiltrate Mobius without concealing her name and face is just a ridiculous contrivance.
This is ridiculous.
The evil within has always had a problem justifying this, and also why Kidman's around despite her rampant insubordination. Neither game makes any attempt to ever justify these disconnects. What's even funnier is how Torres feels the need to make sure Sebastian takes his wife seriously for setting this plan up. But Sebastian has already been shown to have a high opinion of his wife and even repeats this sentiment later on. I'm not sure why the writers feel so heavy-handed and insecure about making sure that we know that Myra's got the stuff to pull this off. Is the position of a progressive writer that we don't give women flowers enough? So let's contrive a set of imaginary male chauvinists to smack on the hand and make sure that we give her flowers? And this admonition comes from a lady who powerlifts tree trunks, sounds like she eats cigarettes, and feels the need to belittle Sebastian for happening to be older, despite the fact that he's still killing monsters just fine, and this is a virtual world, so it doesn't really mean anything.
This is a lot to take in.
I'm sure it is, but let's not lose focus.
There's even a line late game where Hoffman, the psychologist, says she's a good soldier, and Torres does her best Michelle Rodriguez impression with,
She's a good soldier.
You're damn right I am.
it's like, would you chill out with the bravado? This in concert with Torres's glib delivery of many voice lines, like she's just in this cool adventure game like Uncharted, just makes me feel like she's from a different property entirely, like an action movie. She's yet another example of how goofy the tone can get in this sequel. But things get better soon as we follow Hoffman's trail and find out that she's actually encountered the first Mobius agent, O'Neill, but he's been warped by Father Theodore into a flame-throwing monster. We get a great boss fight here, and an emotional ending as he thanks us for ridding him of the influence of Father Theodore. He tells us that the stable field emitter that we guard the Obscurib from is actually the key to Father Theodore keeping himself concealed from us. So we go into the next room, destroy it, and open the pathway.
Operation Kick Ass happening in 3, 2, 1.
Unfortunately, Father Theodore makes his presence known, confusing Sebastian with another guilt-ridden vision of Lily that tricks us into shooting Torres. We black out and awake in Sebastian's old home. Here he reminisces about Lily as a child and we come upon a wall of Myra's accomplishments, where we have to yet again acknowledge her competency.
Myra, what an incredible woman. She really could do it all. No wonder she was able to infiltrate Mobius. Once she set her mind to something, she wouldn't stop. Not like me.
Weirdly enough, as much as the game likes to keep hammering this home for the third time, I still don't know anything about her as a person, and I already knew this much about her from the first game's journal entries that everybody makes fun of. Yes, we know she's tenacious, and we know she's competent. I wasn't surprised by that, I wasn't taken aback by that, I just accepted it. Okay, you're telling me that? Alright, right on. Okay. Fortunately, a vision of Myra shows up to clear up this heavy-handed portrayal of her, and she helps Sebastian deal with his guilt. Whereas quite a bit of the story's sentimentality has felt rather performative to this point, here we get nuanced vocal performances and scene blocking that has a lot lying beneath the surface. Marcus's delivery of this line really got to me, as does Elizabeth Sada's response as Myra.
I failed you. I couldn't save Lily from the fire. I failed everyone.
That's not true, Sebastian. There was no fire to save her from. You know this now. Mobius are a force of nature. What you're doing, it's like blaming yourself for an earthquake. It wasn't your fault. You have to stop torturing yourself.
Notice how her hand rests reassuringly on Sebastian's leg. Sebastian's initially reluctant to reciprocate because of his guilt, and he holds back, not quite accepting her reality that she's actually here with him. And once he starts to warm up to the idea of her really being here with him, she's already gotten up to leave as he reaches his hand out. It's very touching, but it's also tragically foreshadowing of the ending, that Myra is effectively already gone, just out of reach, because of her commitments to taking Mobius down from the inside over returning to her family. This new lease on forgiveness realized within himself, Sebastian awakes to find Hoffman sitting over Torres' dead body, and again, Sebastian is racked by grief.
Damn it. She didn't have to die like that. She was a good soldier.
You're damn right I am.
didn't we just go over this, dude? Now, maybe the writer's intent here was to test Sebastian's resolve, since he technically just had that episode within his own mind, and now he's having to deal with this guilt outside of himself, reality setting in. But back to back, these scenes feel a little bit redundant, right? Sebastian wallowing in self-pity, forgiving himself, then wallowing in self-pity again at the first realization that he accidentally shot Torres. It makes you wonder if Sebastian's a little slow on the uptake. Regardless, Sebastian recovers very quickly, almost comedically so, with Hoffman's help. She says the bullet wound wasn't what killed Torres, it was the wounds that she sustained while defending Seb from zombies. So once again, Seb is not to blame, and he centers himself saying,
"You're right. That goddamn son of a bitch. This is what he wants. Trying to make me feel guilty."
It's so satisfying to hear him nut up, and there's more of this fun attitude to come. There's also a great callback to how Hoffman already knew that he'd achieved some self-growth because she's the team psychologist.
I can see that you're ready.
How did you? Right.
The team psychologist.
Hoffman says that Father Theodore's stronghold has appeared now that the stable field emitter's broken, but they need to make a similar device to shield themselves from all the psychic fire that still guards it. We part ways briefly for a time while Hoffman makes this device out of spare parts, and we go help Sykes, who's found a backdoor in the system. We help him escape, but we find out that this backdoor escape means that it's very possible that he also just got lost in the system, adrift in the far reaches of STEM. And once he's gone, the game feels decidedly lonely. It's about to get lonelier. Once the device to get through Theodore's firewall is built, Sebastian reports back to Hoffman, and they embark on the most treacherous part of their journey yet, wading through lava men as their not terribly well-made force field emitter keeps fritzing out and barely getting them across the finish line. Well, gets Sebastian across the finish line. Comically, Sebastian neglects to use his gun or jump nearly far enough to grab Hoffman as she's dragged away by lava men. I really don't like the blocking of this scene. It just makes Sebastian look like an idiot. But I guess it's just one more motivator for Sebastian to get his revenge. Now here's where the game really regains its swagger, and it starts to reach back into the legacy of the first game in a really enriching and honorific way that makes this really the indispensable entry that it is for me. After Seb breaches the outer defense of Theodore's stronghold, Theodore reaches out to him and asks him to join up so that they can dominate STEM and turn it back on Mobius.
Why does everyone want to control Union? It's not even real.
Union is better than reality. Union is Mobius. Their minds are connected to it. To control Union is to control them. To control them is to control the world.
This is a big idea and one that has big implications for the scope of where future games could go, but it gets better. The first sign that something cool was about to happen should have been the fire pipes, fire barriers, and shootable switches that look just like the ones in the furnace rooms in the first Evil Within. Soon, we run into Theo in his throne room, and it's clear that Sebastian is not joining up and has become stronger since they last met, forgiving himself so that Theodore has to unleash his last mental onslaught. And for fans of the first Evil Within, this might be the coolest thing ever. The horrible events of Beacon Hospital flash before our eyes, and this perfect scene happens.
Yes, you remember it all.
Sebastian's realization of what's to come when he hears the sadist chainsaw from the intro of the first game is utter perfection. Even better is Sebastian's reaction.
Enough of this shit!
This gets a huge belly laugh from me every time I hear it, and all 3 times I played this game for this review recently, it got me. Now he messes the sadist up 12 ways to Sunday, but the sadist has got some fight in him yet, parrying Sebastian's chainsaw attack. And I'm convinced that this little exchange right here is where RE4 Remake got that idea to deflect the chainsaws with the knife, but correct me if I'm wrong. Regardless though, Sebastian wins the QuickTime event and divides and conquers this SOB Evil Dead style. But his victory is short-lived as he's soon ripped away from the scene by barbed wire around his feet, and he's pulled into a fight with 1 and then 2 keepers. Even dressed up in this too clean art style, the keepers are still fearsome threats, accompanied by the excellently unnerving battle music from the first game too. Once dead, his safe head opens to reveal the worst possible occupant, Laura, Ruvik's sister. Now we can blast her with weapons, but as we know from the first game, fire seems to do the trick. So you can either flamethrower her to death here for an achievement, or we can activate the furnace and blast her with that. This whole sequence is just utterly divine and so full of attitude and respect for the original, and it also feels like a torch passing moment from Mikami to Johanas, and I'm all here for it. In fact, while much of the second game can feel off to me, there are numerous homages for the first game like this that instantly make it feel authentic. And it just makes me wish that this game had hewed a lot closer to the tone and iconography of the last game because it does it so well. And it's clearly in their mind. Tatiana the nurse returns as the voice of inner strength for Sebastian, and she's much funnier and more expressive this time around.
That's perfect. You may very well be the best detective.
The save rooms are entered through mirrors that crack as Claire de Lune plays, just as they were in the last game. You still upgrade yourself through the electric chair, and you hear the same sounds when you bring up the inventory menu, click to look through your weapons and inventory, or when you die. There's also an early cutscene of a police psychiatrist on the Mobius payroll who gaslights Sebastian into making him doubt the horrors of Beacon as being real. We see Sebastian's old self sitting in a familiar pool of blood before Laura's arms pull him down, and back into Union, where the words "never forget" are scrawled on the wall in blood, a message not just to Sebastian, but also to fans.
STEM marks you in ways that I think no one's aware of yet.
So maybe Beacon really never left Sebastian, nor can it. The Anima Ghost also takes you back to Beacon for 3 encounters that end with Sebastian effectively killing a version of himself that symbolizes his trauma there. Another callback is the staircase that plays various scenes from the first game and even shows us Ruvik. Notice how I even opted for Sebastian's costume from the first game for my footage. Perhaps best of all though, we also learn from Kidman that Joseph is not dead like he seemed to be in the first game. All these moments leading up to the boss rush from the first game just solidify my view that while I don't always jive with everything from The Evil Within 2, it's still an indispensable title for someone like me who's just an uber fan of the first game. It's still a part of the family even if it feels like a distant cousin that I maybe haven't seen in a while and surprised at how they turned out years later.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
Once we defeat the last boss, they revert back into Theodore's form, who's been totally outdone by Sebastian's resolve, but Myra steals the kill from us by ice-picking him in the solar plexus. She destroys the stronghold and disappears into the destruction, and Sebastian conveniently falls right where she ran off to, in this Silent Hill 2 but without the fog area that sports some of the coolest sights in the distance, but is unfortunately pretty boring to fight through. All that kept me going was really the emotional motivation to figure out what made Myra this way and why she seems to be fighting against this very Ruvik-looking version of herself. Now, aside from a fun, if janky little boss fight with something that looks like the Amalgam Alpha from the first game, the lead up to the final encounter is uneventful till we hit the dreamlike and honestly phenomenal last stage of the game, the icy expanse leading up to a psychic representation of Sebastian and Myra in Lily's family home. The music here, composed by Masatoshi Yanagi and performed by the legendary City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra, is phenomenally soulful and only increases in intensity as it goes. Enough praise cannot be given how good this track is. And when Sebastian ascends the top of this mountain to get home, we see visions showing us that Myra speaking with members of Mobius who are conspiring to bring Mobius down from within. Theodore even started out as one of them, although it's likely that he was just feigning interest in their plot so that he could betray them all for his dreams of power. But while this backstory is cool, he still feels like he comes out of absolutely nowhere as far as the player and Sebastian is concerned, and he has to be constantly legitimized into the plot, kind of retrofitted into it, in order to feel like anything more than just a metaphor or a plot device. And while it's unclear, and I've heard fans speculate that Theodore might be the one that twisted Myra into this monster as he did to O'Neill, this theory falls apart because she's not under his control. She's a completely rogue agent. It would appear that her obsession with protecting her daughter is what has driven her to become this monster, so that she's no longer helping her daughter but harming her. This is a funny predicament to be in, thematically, because while it explains her motivation, Sebastian's like,
"No, Myra. This isn't real. Pain is part of real life, and so is love. If she stays in here, she won't live a life free from fear. Because she won't be living a life at all."
You don't understand.
just go back to the real world. Now, some people might call this mansplaining.
Have you heard about this?
We know what mansplaining is.
Mansplaining is when a man will condescendingly explain something to a woman that she already knows.
And while I don't care to participate in that kind of liberal sense of the word, it's interesting and sort of confusing because you wonder what the game is actually trying to say here. We keep getting told that, Torres is a badass and, she don't need no man to help her pick up logs, and make sure you give your wife credit for how smart she is. But then the plot devolves into this weird pity party for Sebastian, like, hey, I know you didn't believe your wife, but you really just need to get over herself and quit being so dramatic. It's like the most bizarre subversion of all the virtue signaling that we've been getting. The fact that a ghost of her in Seb's mind also forgives him carte blanche, it's also an interesting choice. Are we really blaming a desperate woman fighting a villainous megacorporation mostly by herself for being a little too invested? And then she turns into a monster because of all the stress she's under. It's like, whose side are you on, writing team? Now, this is not a bad boss fight, and its visuals are pretty stupendous, but it is a clunky one, as it's yet another shoot the weak spots fight, and holy crap are they hard to get a beat on even with the slow-mo ability. We're also fighting our own wife as a monster. Now, obviously this is meant to be a dramatization for fun, kind of a microcosm of a specific stressful episode in their marriage that's blown up into epic proportions. But isn't it kind of funny that she stress transforms into this kind of monstrous version of herself, almost representing maybe what she became to Sebastian? She's a woman that won't be believed. There's a lot of baggage here. Like, maybe this is what a woman who won't be believed becomes to a man who can't take her seriously. Or to basically turn your nutty wife into a boss fight that you need to kind of get out of your hair feels like a little bit of a betrayal of all the virtue signaling from earlier. Let's also not forget the presence of the anima from earlier, a soul-sucking woman feeding off trauma and turning people insane. The anima is a concept in Jungian psychology that is the unconscious feminine side in men. So the anima haunts Sebastian, the female within him, reminding him of his past, nagging him, if you will, asking us to submit. A parody, perhaps, of Myra's insistence to Sebastian that she listen to him and believe her suspicions that their daughter isn't dead, and a secret society is actually behind all of this. The anima is also the sensitivity in men that allows them to relate to women, and so it's of special import that this term is used to describe what is essentially commentary on Sebastian's outlook on his marriage. And yet we have the game also telling us that nothing is really his fault. Kind of a wish fulfillment that we all wish we could get. That the person who we're the most likely to offend is the person giving us full and complete absolution. The messaging just feels contradictory, preachy at one moment, and then being perfectly willing to subvert all those in favor of main character syndrome.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
After the rather epic boss fight against your wife, we pull her body away from the debris and have a heart-to-heart that Seb has to take Lily away from here. As we enter the house, we start on what is the final leg of our journey, the dramatic conclusion, switching from Seb pushing one door open to reveal Kidman on the other side, going through another door in Mobius headquarters. So Mobius has realized that Union is going to collapse, and they need to bring Lily back to use as the core on STEM systems in the future. But surprise, surprise, they want to go ahead and get rid of Sebastian so they can do so, and she rebels yet again and goes full auto on all the Mr. Smiths she sees and some truly mediocre third-person cover shooting combat. Then we get another sweet door transition back to Sebastian, who secures Lily, and they have a touching reunion. He carries her downstairs for perhaps the most important scene in Evil Within canon. There is Myra, who says she can't accompany them because Mobius must be stopped. The only way to do so is from within, by activating a pulse that will affect all of Mobius.
Okay, fine, I'll wait. Once Mobius is gone,
It doesn't work that way, Sebastian. It can only be done from inside. STEM is more than just this place. All of Mobius are connected to it via the chips in their heads. Once I assume the power of the core, I can transmit a signal just as Union collapses. A signal that can take Mobius down once and for all.
But we're finally together again.
There's no other choice. This is part of the plan. It always has been. I'm sorry.
Myra.
Shh. Just promise to take care of the little one.
It gets to me even as I write this, the scene playing out next to me. And then they part for the last time, leaving me in shambles. Back in Mobius, Kidman sets up the pulse, revealing to the administrator that she took her chip out already, and so as he tries to get to her first with his little kill switch in his hand, it does nothing, while her pulse satisfactorily destroys him. Back to Sebastian, we can see him evading the destruction of STEM, and eventually both scenes line up to where Mobius dies a horrible, glorious death, and our hero and his daughter come back to the real world. With Kidman saying goodbye to Seb and Lily before they drive away to a passable version of one of my favorite songs in Duran Duran's Ordinary World. Horror story. The evil within never quite dies, and back in Mobius HQ, the STEM screens come back online. That's pretty cool, huh? Now, obviously there are plot holes aplenty with how Kidman and Meyer are even part of Mobius and how they could possibly be so stupid to hire people clearly not in league with them in the first place, and also not having any fail-safes to prevent certain excitable people from going inside the system and destroying them from within it. They also don't seem to be able to monitor much of anything inside STEM, almost ever. And they keep doing the same faulty thing over and over again. So it's dumb, but it's all just a way to have the cool thing happen inside of STEM, so I won't hold it against them.
You are foolish, but oddly admirable.
In fact, all this is a little bit my takeaway from The Evil Within 2. Yes, it makes a little bit more sense this time around in that it's linear. There's not really any jumping around, no really interpretation to be had, but you also don't have any negative space or theory crafting type of ability either here. What you see is what you get, making The Evil Within 2 more of a sci-fi thriller than a supernatural horror mystery, and one that makes a lot of improbable contrived turns to get to the end. Not to mention its villains that just sort of show up as plot devices is not my favorite thing. The villains just seem jam-packed in there, and they have less and less justification for existing, and thus less satisfaction when they're defeated. There's also a lot of symbolic messaging around the kind of feminism angle that gets totally left on the table. And even if you're not really a feminist, you can see why it might be strange to sort of bake that into the intro and then totally abandon it by the end. But while the means to get to the end are a little weird, I think the end is still a pretty fantastic emotional ending. Feels a lot like Max Payne 2, actually. Much like Max Payne 2 compared to the first Max Payne, I like the first one a lot more. Both have weak villains that kind of come out of nowhere, and the end boss is a frenemy, and they're both about sad dads coming to peace with the loss of their families. Both endings are very touching, and they wrap up things in 2 outings, which is very unusual for this industry. Although, of course, Joseph still being alive and Ruvik still being out there is caused to think this story is not really truly over. But by finally making Sebastian a person, we've established him for future games. The Evil Within may be haunting, but The Evil Within 2 is healing. And while that means that we may miss out on some great stuff this time around, we also get something we never expected from this series too. But there were concessions in an attempt to make this game more accessible, and these I'll never quite jive with. Evil Within 2 just feels like it was very much made in the ALOU era, or after The Last of Us. While the first game came out a mere year after The Last of Us did and felt similar in terms of gameplay, its story focus is a lot different than the preferred way that big blockbuster games would tell their stories, much like BioShock Infinite, GTA 5, and Red Dead Redemption 2 a couple years later. The fact that Sony exclusives like the new God of Wars or Ghost of Tsushima or what have you are now the gold standard for cinematic storytelling in games, I'd say this prediction feels pretty right. The Evil Within just didn't have quite that same emphasis and didn't have that same connecting quality. It was more gloomy and weird, and its characters were more caught in a web of cool lore and cool storytelling bits more than they were the drivers and the agents that people would connect with per se. The Evil Within 2 is smart to sort of lay these more old school ideas to the side and conform to these new standards, and certainly not all their choices are bad. Tango's essentially apologizing for so much that they end up repenting of their best ideas and their best instincts. It all feels a bit neutered by the time it gets to the end, more of a sci-fi thriller with safe and recognizable motifs to get you in the idea of, like, oh, that's what that type of thing is. Oh, I get it. And so it never quite feels as wacky or as unpredictable or as cinematic as the first game does. There's just not the same level of cinematic intelligence until maybe the last scene. They just don't blend together or pop in the same way that the first games did. The first game felt influenced by movies like, say, the wide-angle shots, the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, or Dracula's Castle in the distance from the old Hammer horror movies, or that glorious attention to detail when you get up close and tight on the environment like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Evil Within feels like it's translating movie tropes into game form, whereas The Evil Within 2 feels like it's a game trying to translate itself into a movie. Does that make sense? While the colors pop in The Evil Within 2, there was almost none of that edge in its set design outside of those gruesome moments with Stefano. Its assets and its granular detail are just too clean, too pretty, and too gamified. Now, The Evil Within 2's got some incredibly emotional moments, and there's a lot of things it does well. The stealth feels pretty good. The open world encounter design is fantastically paced and balanced, but it never quite sticks with me in the same way that its predecessor does because it feels a little bit more homogenized around gaming tropes more than trying to do its own thing. The Evil Within 2's strength and weakness is that it is more playable, quote unquote, but it's also the reason it's less special to me, less challenging, less engaging, both artistically and in terms of just what you're doing in the game. Now, the Evil Within 2's gameplay is never terrible, and at times it can feel great, with some great sound effects and feedback. But even when it feels great, it often feels like it's generic to control, kind of like it had to make it so easy and simple. that it stands out all the more when put to the test. They start to kind of break down by the strain of combat. Bad hit detection, stiff aiming, a camera that's often too close to Sebastian's back and somehow has a view of just like his torso to the top of his head. And there's also some just rock stupid AI that's hard to influence in stealth sections. But at least stealth is really powerful, and it's far better than the gunplay. So for no other reason, you'll have a lot of fun just playing this like a stabbing simulator.
I'm gonna stab the shit out of you.
Let's not forget the open world design being some of the best you'll ever see. It's the true innovation of this game and really should have been ripped off 100 times by now, but we keep making these checklist open worlds with boring side activities instead of making these crafted, balanced experiences that clearly feel play tested. Let's not look past the Evil Within 2's ending being one of the very best that you'll ever see, or how many cool homages it has to the first game that enrich it and kind of give it a special place in the pantheon that makes it indispensable for superfans of the series like me. Tango just can't not make a game I don't end up liking, even if it takes me a minute to warm up to it. Their games just feel crafted and intentional, even when they're kind of playing with somebody else's building blocks. But we almost never heard from Tango again after Microsoft shut them down on May 7th, 2024. Tango was totally adrift until PUBG and Callisto Protocol publisher Krafton bought them and the Hi-Fi Rush IP. Unfortunately, this meant that the rights to the Evil Within and Ghostwire Tokyo remained with Microsoft, so God knows if we'll ever see an Evil Within 3. Now, Hi-Fi Rush in 2022 had an Easter egg with robot versions of Sebastian and Joseph, and Tango was working on a 10-year anniversary remaster of the Evil Within when they were shut down, so clearly they were at least interested in revitalizing interest in the series again, so who knows? Maybe Microsoft will pull one of those Rockstar deals where they bring back the old developer of the Max Payne series to do the remakes that they still own the rights to. But if Microsoft did this, what would an Evil Within 3 possibly even look like? Well, for me, it has to address Joseph still being alive and Ruvik's escape into the real world, possibly building on the fact that the computers came back on maybe because STEM had a failsafe. More members were able to withstand that type of psychic blast, making them feel a little bit more competent than they seem to be in this game. Or it could have just been Ruvik turning that back on and has to rebuild a STEM system for himself. What I'm thinking is that perhaps Ruvik is tired of having to hide away and make this little pocket reality for himself. Maybe now he wants to make that reality the reality on planet Earth and just override it entirely. The end of the Evil Within shows that Sebastian's ears are ringing again while he sees a Leslie-possessed Ruvik in the distance, intimating that STEM is clicked on again. But that could only work if Ruvik himself had somehow become sort of a wireless STEM hotspot now that he's out in the real world. Perhaps now he's able to pull anyone within range into his mental orbit so he can do as he wills to them, much like he did in the beginning of the Beacon incident. The idea of Ruvik being basically this STEM hurricane that just lays waste to cities as he eventually blacks out everyone in its swath and totally detaches them from reality is a chilling one, and one made more interesting from the idea that maybe from a gameplay perspective, Ruvik's ability to do this is very powerful but unstable, glitching in and out so that the real world comes back into play from time to time. This would be a whole new gameplay wrinkle and maybe add some cool Soul Reaver style back and forth between worlds. We also can't forget that Ruvik fighting over Leslie's body for control would make him an interesting, unpredictable villain this time around, and might easily account for why his wireless STEM abilities are kind of fritzing in and out as the balance of power shifts between the two personalities. I think this would make him more distinct and would also give us a chance to maybe dig into Leslie's backstory a little more, humanize him a little bit, and make the main characters have to figure out how to reach him and wrest control away from Ruvik. Now, speaking of our main characters, who would that be? Now, the candidates are Sebastian, a grown-up Lily, Kidman, or Joseph. Now, Sebastian's gotten his happy ending already, but if the computers are back on because Mobius insulated themselves somehow from Myra's blast, he's definitely going to want to make sure that her sacrifice isn't in vain and make sure to put them down once and for all so they don't come back for Lily. But Sebastian, much as I love him, also has a lot less to prove as a character, and so I think it would make more sense for him to be a sidekick in this game so that the characters who haven't already gotten their good endings could have some time to flourish. Lily succeeding him, much like Rose Winters did her father in the RE Village DLC, would be pretty cool, especially since her mind is supposed to be pretty adept at handling STEM, and maybe even giving her a Jesse Faden level of control over her surroundings would be really cool and make her a distinct protagonist with some interesting gameplay ramifications. Part of me wants Joseph to be playable because his DLC was cut, but he's a helpful, caring type of person who plays the support role well, so maybe it's just best that he's a side character, or maybe even someone who's playable in small bursts like Ashley was in RE4 or something like that. Either way, I want to see him wind up with Kidman, whom he's said to have the hots for in the first game, and he does still need to reconnect with Sebastian and find out that Lily survived the fire years ago after all. He may be a Darth Vader style character at this point who's changed for the worse and had his sensitive disposition ravaged, so we may need to reach him much like we would Leslie. That might also make him better yet again to be an NPC that has an impact on the story, much as he was in the main game and Kidman's DLCs. And speaking of Kidman, I still think she makes the most sense as the protagonist unless we go full-on new territory with Lily. Kidman has extra motivation to see to it that Mobius doesn't stick around to exact revenge on her for the bevy of betrayals that she's responsible for. I'd also like to see her work with Joseph and have, love blossom and that be their happy ending as they take down Mobius once and for all. A longtime friend of the channel and actually the new writer for the Relentless Frontier indie shooter that you should all check out, GV97, floated this idea to me. That the game actually be comprised of a lot of fights against the various Mobius agents that survive the cull, perhaps making these Mobius agents sort of the MacGuffins in the story, the boss fights that either our heroes have to fight against, or maybe, just maybe, we get to control Ruvik. Now, of course, this would be absolutely ridiculous to develop something just for Ruvik, but it might also give us a really interesting insight into Leslie as a character as we have to embody and kind of follow these guys as Ruvik takes out his revenge on the Mobius people still around and gathers power for himself to make this wireless worldwide stem a reality. I really can't get the idea of Ruvik essentially warping into town like a psychic tornado, pulling people into his mind to destroy them, kind of like what Pinhead did to Hell in the Scarlet Gospels book. I think the Evil Within's really got to go big and crazy, and I think Tango owes it to themselves to not only follow up on what happened to Joseph, but to take out Ruvik once and for all. They just need a chance to end their story emphatically if they really want to. So that's what I think of The Evil Within 2 and what I hope to see in a forthcoming sequel. Now, in my Defense of The Evil Within video, I implored people to do as Bruce Lee said in Enter the Dragon.
Don't think. Feel.
Now, here I can reiterate the admonition with the caveat that you don't have to turn your brain off nearly as much, but do know that it will only help you so much. The Evil Within's not a thinking man's game per se, but it is sometimes very moving entertainment. The Evil Within 2 is uneven sometimes and repeats a few too many of its predecessor's mistakes for what's supposedly a fixed game, but the ending is utterly glorious pop opera goodness and stands out as one of the best instances of a game that, no matter what happened before, this is a great game because it knew when to end and how to end. So don't turn your brain off, but don't overthink it either. Just appreciate the art.
Appreciate the art. Fine. As long as it gets me closer to you, I'll play your game.
Thanks for watching. Before I go, I'd like to give a huge shout out to those of you generous enough to support my work by becoming a patron. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, Halcyon Loon, Hey Blondie, Yaksho, M, BBF and Bloxburg, and Melancholy Geek. And an extra special thank you to those of you donating at my highest paid tiers, The Nth Review and James Wyatt. Now, if you'd like to keep what few lights I have on, you should join these folks at patreon.com/midnightmedium or become a YouTube channel member or donate at Ko-fi or PayPal. Also check out my GOG and NordVPN affiliate links to support me with no extra cost to you. And if you aren't tired of me yet, check me out as I join Deadforge and Robert Yap in the Quad Damage podcast, where we talk first-person shooters with developers and content creators alike. God bless you everyone, and I'll see you soon.